What happens during change? I think a good question at this time. We've seen a lot of change in the world. A lot of things are happening in the world these days, all across the world. I know in my lifetime the world never experienced change like it does right now. I like to think about the time when Jesus was on earth. Excuse me. One of my favorite stories or parts of the Bible to read is the ministry of Jesus Christ on earth. I don't think until that point the world had ever gone through a change like it did at that time, especially the religious world. Not so much the secular world, but the religious world really faced a great change at that time. And it caused a lot of reaction in people and a lot of reaction, rethinking and stuff like that. In Matthew chapter number 3, it talks about the axe will be laid to the root. In other words, things are not going to be just challenged on the surface, but really down to the root. And there's going to be change made. And I like Hebrews chapter number 12 talks about that everything is going to be shaken. And all those things that are not stable, they will fall and shatter, and only the stable things will stay. And so a great change, and a lot of things were challenged, a lot of things were shaken, a lot of things were fallen, and so I like that story. I like how the world reacted, how the religious world reacted to this presentation of change. And change is one of the hardest things. I remember taking a leadership course, and that course they were teaching about how to lead change. And that is one of the hardest things for leaders to do, is to lead change into people. And there's what they call the unfreeze and the refreeze, or the freeze part. And so you have to almost break free. You have to unfreeze. You have to break free from where you're at and what you're doing and the mindset you've had. You have to break free from that. And then, so you have to unfreeze, and then you have to move, and then you have to refreeze if there's not that site where people will say, okay, here I can park, here I can stay. I just have to move from here to here, and then I can stay again. You can't lead them into a nowhere land. You can't lead them into a destination or a place without destination. Just down the road. And so there's always has to be a destination, and there has to be shorter destinations. And so, but change is probably one of the toughest things for people to face. One of the toughest things to seek in the ministry, and because there's constant change that we want to lead people to. And so it caused many to turn to are many to resist and put their stopper on as soon as you use the word change. But I want to talk a little bit about what does change do for us? What do we experience? What's the purpose of change? I have 9 things that I want to discuss, that I want to talk about when we think about change. And maybe you're facing change in your life, and maybe it's from one person to the next. It is the change is very different, and so. But I just want to talk a little bit about change and some things that are good for us to keep in mind when we think about change. Number 1 is there's always a price to be paid, and someone has to pay that price. Whenever there's change, there's always a price to be paid, and someone has to pay that price. It is not just a choice, but a change in how we think, communicate, how we function, a change in the direction we go. There's always a lot of undoing and redoing and all that comes with a price. And so change cannot be had without a price. And so there's always a price, and someone has to pay that price. Now, I say someone has to pay that price because it's not always necessarily the person that changes. Can be, often is, generally probably even is. But it's not necessarily the person that experiences the change that pays the price for the change. And so, but we must keep in mind, there's always a price to be paid. Sometimes people are in a very religious church and they want change. The problem is no one wants to pay the price that is necessary for the change to take place. The price can be in many different things. The price can be a time of insecurity, a loss of possession, whatever, cost of things breaking, tearing things down, rebuilding things. But there's always a price that is paid, that has to be paid, and someone has to pay that price. And so we have to, sometimes we end up paying a price and we say, boy, that is just, I shouldn't have to pay this price because I'm not experiencing the change is not for me. Ask Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ paid the price for the change during his earthly time. And of course, the ultimate change for us from death to life, from condemnation to justification, from darkness to light, and on and on and on. The ultimate change. And who paid the price? Jesus Christ. Now, we do pay a price also when we come into the Christian life. In fact, I was putting a message that I preached some time ago. I was getting it ready to put it online. It is the price in Christianity. And so we do pay a price inside of it, but we don't pay the price for it. And so we have to keep in mind there's always a price to pay. And someone will have to pay, and it may be you. And so don't take it too hard when you end up paying a price for it. Because maybe you say, it's too great of a price, or it's not fair. Just remember that someone has to pay a price, and that there is a price, and someone has to pay it. Number two, when we go through change, there is a strict and strong behavior judgment. When a person leaves a group, company, etc., to join another group or another company, there's always a more intense judging of his behavior. And so, when one person leaves one church and he goes to another church, or leaves one denomination, goes to another denomination, leaves one company, goes to another company, he puts himself in a place where his behavior is going to be judged in a much more intense way than he generally is being judged. And here's the thing, mistakes are going to be magnified. People are going to look for mistakes. They're going to magnify the mistakes, where maybe you're going through, and maybe you're going from one church or even from one religion to another religion. And mistakes that you used to make, where people looked past them, never had a second thought about it. Maybe even character issues. People were used to your character issues, and you were used to your character issues. That's just, you say, that's just who I am, and stuff like that. And now all of a sudden you make one little mistake, people jump on it, people make it 10 times bigger than you thought it was, or you think it should be. And so that is what happens during time of change. When either you go through a change or there's change in general, there is a much more intense way of judging behavior. And so we just got to be used to that. We just got to remember that happens. That is just part of change. That is part of paying the price of change. That is part of what it takes to change. That's why people fear change, because they don't want to pay the price. They don't want to be judged intently. And so when you start, let's say you start a new church, People will judge you very strictly, and they will pick you apart to the finest little detail, and they will magnify those little details and those mistakes. If there is one place where things don't line up, or where there's a little issue, I mean, before they look past it, didn't mention it. If you would mention, they would say, "Oh, no big deal." Now that is the focal point. Look at America. Look at how some people are being judged, and so intently, so stripped apart and taken apart, and look for the smallest, slightest little thing, and just jump on that and judge and judge and judge and judge. That's what happens during change. So there's number one, there is always a price to be paid, and someone has to pay it. There is a much stricter way of judging behavior, and maybe even how you judge yourself. I know I have experienced going through some change in my life, and I noticed I judged myself very differently, much more intently. I questioned my ways a lot more. I looked at my behavior, and I looked at my character in fine little detail. And sometimes I wished others wouldn't have done in such detail as they did. But even myself, I would judge myself very differently. And so that is something that happens during time of change. And so number three, during time of change. Number three is when change is happening, people see it as an opportunity to get into position, leadership, and spread their influence. So whenever there's change happening, and I've talked about the church, this can be in business, and of course I, working with the church and in ministry, in Christian ministry, I can relate so much to the church. Can happen in your business, can happen in a company, it can happen in a community, it can happen in a family, it can happen across the board. But whenever there's change happening, then there's always people standing on the sideline. They're looking for position, they're looking for leadership, they're looking to spread their influence. They're spreading their thinking, their philosophies, their opinions, their doctrine. And so they will jump in at such a time. And so, for an example, if you start a new business, you will have people on the sideline, and I could run that for you, and I could fill this position, and have you thought of this, and have you thought of this, and why are you doing it that way, and stuff like that. And that happens when change is happening, and there's always those people. They've been standing on the sideline, and they're just looking for a group to leave a church, and they will jump in there, and they say, okay, now I get my chance to have my position. Now I get to be a leader. Now I get to do the influencing. And so I get my opportunity. And so they're just looking for a chance, because when you're moving from one place to another, in between, you're loose, you're open, you're unfrozen, as the teaching was, and so there's an open door to get in. You're open for ideas, you're open for teaching, and so if you were not, you wouldn't make change. And so immediately there's people that will jump at that chance, and they will look for that position. They will look for that influence. Maybe they deserve it. Maybe their stuff is good. But we have to be aware that these people are going to be there, and they're going to jump at that chance, and they're going to try to get that inroad, and they're going to be quickly, and they're going to be the first ones to show up and say, look at here is my opportunity, and so that is something that we need to be aware of. So number one, there's always a price to be paid, and someone has to pay it. There's number two, there is a much more intense way of judgment, and number three, there is always people standing on the sideline, waiting on the sideline to jump in to get their opportunity for position, leadership, and influence. Number four, there is always casualties. Always casualties. This is the sad part about change. There's always casualties. There's always people that react the wrong way. There's always people that use that opportunity to drop their character, to drop their standard, to drop their beliefs. And so here this change happens, and a group goes from one group to another group, a person goes from one place to another place. He may lose a friend. Where always the person, all of a sudden your friend is gone and is a casualty. And here's a person that was a good Christian and moves along with the group, with the change, and ends up in the world, ends up in carnality, ends up dropping their faith, ends up walking away from it all. And people are going to jump on that, and they're going to judge, and they're going to say, you should have stayed. You should not have been involved in the change. Look at the casualties. Look at, you're hurting people. You're destroying people. And so what we must do is consider that, but also, because without change, the truth is, if we're not going to change, we're going to continue as we are. Say, well, that's obviously. But we are going to, our influence is not going to increase. Our effectiveness is not going to get better. What we're doing for the world is going to be the same as now. We have no hope unless we change. And so there has to be times of change. Even when you look at the church, there has to be times where a group has to come in, because the church always goes slowly like this, and always ends up in a ditch. There has to be a group sometimes that comes out and starts again, manifests some of the errors that have taken place, and refocus on what God says, refocus on the scripture and teaching the scripture and getting back to those things. And so there's always casualties, and that is sad. Sometimes good people just fall in the cracks, don't make it through the change. But yet, I would say, unless the change is bad, there's always way more people being helped by the change than being hindered by the change. And that is one of the things in ministry. You minister, you may end up hurting someone sometime. Never your intent. But if you always focus so much that you don't ever want to hurt someone, you probably never will help someone. There's always that chance for casualties. We're going to stick with just the 4 for this video, and we're going to split it into 2 videos. And so if you want to watch all 9, I'll have both videos online, so video number 1, video number 2, and so we will cover the last 5 of them in the second video. But 9 things on what to expect during time of change. And so I'll have what to expect during time of change, video 1 and video 2. Amen.